I'm Michelle. Nice to meet you all. I always sneak into these MBAs. Is this an MBA event?
No,
okay.
It's alumni reunion.
I graduated from Haas undergrad in 2011, and I am currently the co-founder and CEO of a company called Awaken. We do diversity, equity, inclusion workshops for companies of all sizes and all industries, but really focused on tech and media. And I really appreciated Elida's question around identities when we're prepping for this panel, because I truly believe that identities are the lenses through which we see the world. And that has a huge impact on the way that I show up to this work and this world. And the identities that are really important to me that have really influenced my perspectives and my experiences are the fact that I'm an immigrant. I came to the States when I was 13 from South Korea. I identify as queer. My pronouns are she and her. I am I grew up low income, so I've been exposed to a lot of experiences that I think have been very hot topics in the States for a long time. Not having access to healthcare, and my dad was undocumented, and I'm Korean American, Asian American, and sort of really interested in looking at all these different intersections in the way that we do our work. So those are some of my identities I'd like to share.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kenny?
Very cool, very cool. So my name is Kenny Vaughn. I'm a 2016 alum of the full-time program, and I'm currently serving as the Director of Diversity Admissions at the United States Military Academy at West Point. So graduated from West Point in 2008 as an undergrad, and have since spent the last 11 years in the military. Coming to Haas was truly an eye-opening experience for me. I think, when people ask, which program did you choose for business school? I said, hey, I wanted to get as similar as experience as I get to going to West Point. So that's why I came out to Berkeley. But being able to get this exposure, this experience, I think has prepared me in ways that I didn't necessarily expect for my current role as a diversity admissions officer. I'm here with my family, so my wife Seneca and my two kids Taj and Deja are here. So you're not allowed to ask me any tough questions. But in all seriousness, it truly is an honor to be back. The Haas family has such a special place in my heart, and I think to be able to have a open and engaging conversation about diversity and equity and inclusion, and the role that it kind of has not only in the workplace but just in our personal lives and interactions, is something that's very exciting for me. So very excited just to share more about that space and field any questions that you all may have.
Thank you. Bvander?
Hi everyone, I'm Bvander Ich. I graduated from the full-time program here in 2010. So almost 10 years ago, I get to participate in this reunion weekend next year. And then I am now CEO and co-founder of Magoosh. So Magoosh is an online test prep company, people preparing for the GMAT, SAT, ACT, et cetera. Started it while I was on campus with some co-founders, so been on that journey for nearly 10 years. More personally, it's interesting hearing sort of Kenny and Michelle talk about their identities, because for me, I think I'm still figuring it out. I use the pronouns he, him, but at the same time, and I'm the son of immigrant parents, but I still am sort of thinking about how I want to represent myself, and so I think it's an ongoing sort of journey that I'm on. But I do currently, outside of my work, and love being a father of two kids who are, I think, both sleeping at home in Berkeley. My daughter very much wanted to come, but I think a nap was in order. So looking forward to getting back to them after this. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much. Now I'd like each of our panelists to speak to their own journey in terms of engaging with diversity, equity, inclusion as part of the work that they're doing professionally, and where that passion comes from for you. Anybody can start.
Well, I guess I'll dive right in.
Start with Kenny.
Yeah, so I actually had a unique road to diversity and inclusion. I'd spent my first 6 years in the military as a missile defense officer, so very outside of the space of diversity and inclusion, but I think having the opportunity to go back and work in the admissions department of the United States Military Academy was something that was very appealing to me. I think as I think about any community that I've been a part of, I think one of the things that's important is being able to give back to the community in a very meaningful way. And for me, I saw this opportunity as the Director of Diversity Admissions to not only contribute to my alma mater in a very deep and meaningful way, but also contribute to a group of individuals that I relate to in a very deep and meaningful way. So having that overlap where you get a chance to work with folks from backgrounds that span the spectrum has been very deep and meaningful. I think there have been a lot of challenges that I didn't necessarily expect going into it, but I think being able to give back to an institution that has given so much to me has been very, very meaningful. So that's kind of what drew me to the work. I think being able to see the tangible fruits of your efforts and your labor and know that you're really kind of setting the course for your institution in terms of having a diverse makeup of students and applicants is something that's been very, very rewarding as well. So I like having the inner space of not only being able to think about some of the strategic plans and some of the strategic initiatives, but also the tangible efforts of the work that we're doing. So I think that's been one of the exciting parts for me in this space.
Thank you. Bvander?
I'm happy to go next. So for me, like I mentioned, I started Magoosh in sort of 2009, 2010, but my journey in diversity, equity, and inclusion really started in 2015. I had attended a conference in which I was sort of listening to a panel talk about their experience and hearing one of the panelists describe their hiring process and how he didn't believe there was necessarily bias in the process until they started anonymizing the resumes and seeing that he was actually passing forward candidates with sort of different backgrounds when they were anonymized versus not, and sort of an eye-opening experience for him. And I used to, wanted to think, I'd say, that I didn't carry bias or our hiring process was unbiased or whatever the case may be. And that was sort of a realization that, oh, wow, there's so much I don't know, and there's so much unconscious bias I probably carry. And sort of just taking that back to our organization at Magoosh and being in a position of power where I am involved in structuring our hiring process, hiring team members, and realizing, wow, this is, I care deeply about fairness, and this to me just aligned strongly with that notion of how do we create a more fair process. And so that was sort of the beginning of that journey for me of realizing, okay, there's a problem that I want to solve within my organization. And then from there, it's just been an ongoing journey of learning and education and realizing every time I learn something new that there's a lot more I don't know. But it's been incredibly rewarding, and to see the changes within our organization over time, and to sort of my personal growth and those around me, their personal growth as we've been on this journey. So that was at least the impetus of how we got started, and sort of where we're at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle, would you care to share about your passions and your journey
Sure.
to DEI work?
Absolutely. My, I think, journey around D&I has really been, I think, my passion for social justice. And I think we use different language in different contexts, but really at the root of it, I believe that the foundation of it has to be rooted in social justice. So when I was in high school and college, I was a troublemaker. I got straight A's, but I still was very much involved in social justice, grassroots organizing work. I was out in the streets protesting, organizing on campus, and then I was told by somebody in undergrad that, oh, getting into Haas is really hard, you probably won't be able to do it. And I said, what? And
He's like, well, watch me.
Excuse me? So I was like, yes, okay, I'm going to get into Haas. And I started and then I got a major in business, and that sort of changed my trajectory, because I think I was not really aware of what opportunities were available to me outside of the organizing field or the nonprofit field. And I actually started my career in management consulting, and quickly realized that diversity and inclusion is a thing that a lot of companies are touting about and doing programming around. And I had a massive cognitive dissonance relating my experiences in social justice to what people were talking about in the corporate space around diversity and inclusion. And I had my fair share of experiences of toxic cultures, both in management consulting but also in tech. So I quickly pivoted my career into tech startups and was building customer success teams. And in both tech and corporate, I felt that the conversations around diversity and inclusion felt very surface level. That companies were putting out very sexy marketing slogans about diversity and inclusion, and yet when you peel back the layers and look at their leaders, none of them is actually doing the work internally and really grappling with these significant issues that are impacting not only their employees but society in general. And I went through a lot of very gaslighting experiences of being inside workshops that actually was adding to the harm. Because I felt that the education burden kept falling on the shoulders of marginalized people inside the companies. So then I wanted to quit and start my own company where we can control the processes and policies in the way that we feel really proud, and start doing education better so that we can create more real spaces where we can have difficult conversations, sit in discomfort, not shy away from that, and really inspire people to do the self-work in addition to systemic work that is so needed for moving the needle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think certainly one of the reasons that I was drawn to coming to Haas was similarly a realization of what an opportunity when you have these stellar students that are coming through business school, going into a variety of industries that then can impact in a positive direction towards social justice in terms of pay equity and hiring opportunities to, health outcomes to education, right? We've got folks with a lot of different foci here at Haas, and wondering if you can speak to maybe a successful strategy that you recently implemented or that you've at some point in your career implemented toward kind of those more fair hiring practices that created opportunities for historically marginalized or underrepresented folks. So a successful strategy that you'd like to highlight for our audience who might be interested in learning something that they can, a nugget they can take with them and implement.
I'm happy to start or kick this off. I can talk about two that we've done at Magoosh among a more holistic program, but two that we've done that I'd say have demonstrated success is one in our hiring process. One of the steps for all the candidates is a take-home assessment. And I'll preface this by saying I actually think there are a lot of problems with a take-home assessment in that if it's too long or people who are working multiple jobs might not have the opportunity to do them, or if the window is not long enough for them, then you might segment out a group of the population that you don't intend to. So we constantly think about this and work on this, but that aside, one of the things we did is we anonymized all of the assessments coming in. So our recruiter would take them, anonymize them so that the hiring manager who was grading the assessments knew nothing about the candidate outside of sort of the assessment, because the assessment was a competency test. And we do this across all roles, but we started across an engineering role. And in addition to that, with those assessments, beyond anonymizing them, the hiring manager would create a rubric. So the way a teacher might create a rubric to score a test, we'd create a rubric ahead of time, calibrate it with someone else, and then actually take people who we know we would hire from other companies or with our own company, have them go through that assessment, but also be anonymized to confirm that, oh, they scored well, so now, not that it's perfect, but some indication that the assessment's reasonably good. And so we started, all of that might sound like a lot, but anonymizing takes maybe 5 to 10 minutes per candidate at most. Once you create a structure, 5 minutes per candidate. Having someone or some folks take the assessment takes a few hours for a few favors, which is well worth it for any position you're hiring for. Calibrating might only take an extra hour from someone else in the company. And so all of these pieces, it can sound like a lot. It's not really that much time. And what we found is as we tracked our funnel, folks from underrepresented groups passed to the next stage more often on the anonymized assessments than when they were not anonymized. And so that was just a notion we had. It was like, wow, we really need to implement this across all of our positions, and now we do. But that's one specific strategy that sort of worked well for us, and one that we sort of advocate for, despite there are challenges, like I've mentioned. Another one in terms of attracting folks underrepresented within the company to Magoosh and this one I've struggled with, is actually sharing the work we do within the company, what we do around trying to be inclusive, the fact that we don't negotiate on our salaries, or a number of other things and how they fit in. We've written about them publicly because we've recognized that if we're not sharing what we do within our company, then it makes it, someone else might view us as another tech startup that doesn't sort of go deeper when it comes to the inclusion work, and why would I want to apply to this company? And so for us, it's been a constant push of like, what are we doing, and then sharing that. And frankly, that makes me feel uncomfortable at times because I know we don't have it all figured out. But we've heard from a number of candidates who have applied that they applied specifically because of those articles, because of the work we're doing. And so, I mean, it's reinforcing in that sense of if you don't talk about it, then no one's going to know. And if no one knows, then you look the same as every other company that's not doing anything. And so that's another thing that sort of has been part of our journey in terms of attracting more underrepresented folks to Magoosh.
That's amazing. And it's like it's increased your applicant pool, and it's actually increased your outcomes in the hiring because of the anonymization. I don't know if you care to share any statistics or data in terms of the before you started anonymizing in 2015 to now, and it's only been a few years.
I don't remember the specifics, but generally I would say it was something like for that cohort, maybe it was before it was like 20% were passing and then 40% were passing, so it might have doubled. That's an estimate, but yeah. And then it's part of a more holistic set of changes that we've implemented.
Sure.
But these are places, you don't have to do everything at once, and that's one learning that we've had. One of our values is this notion of done over perfect. Just make the change that's going to make your process better, rather than feeling overwhelmed by the size of all of the changes you probably should be making, which we know we haven't done all of them either.
Thank you.
I also just want to note that I think it's really meaningful when the C-suite and the CEO or the co-founders actually drive that change. So props to you.
Kenny, do you want to share some practices that you found to be successful in the recruitment?
For sure. So I think one of the biggest things that was a change when I walked into my organization was trying to understand the stakeholder, right? And I think in college admissions, obviously everyone is so focused on the student, student focused, that sometimes we forget that there are a lot of very other influential stakeholders that are helping that student through the process. So as we were kind of peeling back the layers, specifically within some of the underrepresented minorities, one of the things that we found was that you got to get to mama. Like, if mom ain't on board, you can talk to the student all you want. But if mom's not on board and she doesn't understand or dad doesn't understand, then you really are only fighting half the battle. So one of the things that we did was we did a lot of fundraising in order to create a program where not only could we bring students out to visit our campus, but we could also bring out a single parent, one parent to come and really just get a behind-the-scenes view of West Point, because I think, especially for our organization, there are a lot of misperceptions, right? There's a lot of misperceptions about military service, service academies, what it takes to be eligible and competitive to earn a seat at the academy. So while we had done a great job of communicating that value proposition to the student, I think there were some very real gaps that existed that we could have done better with the parents. So for the past 6 years or so, we've brought out about 150 students and parents to the campus over the course of the past few years. And I think out of all the initiatives that we've kind of put in place, the feedback that we've received from that single initiative has been so impactful, because we've had parents come to us at the end of these 3-day visits and they'll say, man, I had no idea this is what West Point was about. Like, getting a chance to speak to your leadership, getting a chance to see that the cadets are young men and women just like my son and daughter. Like, I mean, they're expecting to see people like run around low crawling and do like push-ups and stuff. And that happens a little bit, but for them to be able to see that, hey, these are students just like your son and daughter, and it's a very welcoming and inclusive environment, I think that was huge. And then to your point, I think it really starts by having that leadership engagement, right? So for our superintendent, who is a 3-star general, to stand up and say, hey, this is a priority, right? And this is something that we're getting wrong right now. In, I believe it was around 2014 or 2015, the Chief of Staff of the Army, who is the highest ranking Army official, came to our superintendent and said, hey, West Point has a problem with African Americans and women. These are 2 demographics that you all struggle with right now, and I want to see you fix it. And the great thing about the military is like, it's not like an optional thing. Right? So we might not get it right, but we're gonna work really hard to fix it, right? And I think when you have that clear guidance and really the ownership to say, hey, there's some things we need to work on here. It really trickles down very nicely, and then the resources that are put behind it, obviously that helps too. The last thing that I would say about that is I feel like when you do have that leadership involvement, your alumni, your student body, the folks who can actually help bring these programs into fruition, you get a lot more buy-in, a lot easier than if it's Captain Kenny Vaughn or Major Kenny Vaughn going out and asking for these things to be done. So, I think just revisiting how you look at that stakeholder and realizing that there may be some touch points that you may be overlooking. I think that's a big lesson learned for us at the Academy.
Yeah, and I think it translates also to MBA admissions in that what the data says is that for full-time MBA students, they are primarily listening to family and community first, and then like coaches, but whatever our recruiters here, like that doesn't carry as much weight as what they might be hearing from their own community. And that the other thing that they find is that often people prefer to stay proximal to their community for similar reasons. And as a first generation, when obviously I went to high school a long time ago, but my parents have a sixth grade education, and so the concept of visiting colleges and what it all would entail was quite foreign, and I basically did that whole thing on my own, which now I look back and I can't imagine how I did that. But I went and visited schools all on my own, and so I think it's so wonderful that you're able to offer that opportunity and demystify what that process is, but also then allows them to feel safe and comfortable that they're sending their kid away, and their kid's going to be in good hands. Both of you mentioned that part of that process was, being able to convey your inclusive environment. Michelle, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on how, if you have these successful recruitment efforts and hiring processes, how do you retain employees? When you work as a consultant for companies? What are those kinds of things that you see, as I think has been in the news a lot around tech having these issues of wanting to increase diversity, but what happens is there's a revolving door, right? Folks that are working over here now leave and they go work over there, and so the numbers are all kind of staying the same. They're all just shuffling around. What can folks do to create a better inclusive environment that'll actually want folks to stay at their companies so the numbers can grow?
How long do we have? I think that's a really big question.
Sure.
So I can share a few different just approaches that I often talk about with our clients and how we've shaped our programs around this inclusion and equity inside the workplace. One of my good friends, Ty McCrea, who is heading up D&I at Airbnb, talks about how diversity without inclusion is just tokenism. And I see that a lot in companies where I think for a long time we've been focused on getting more people into the door, right? Underrepresented people into the door. Let's go, source from all these different non-traditional sources to get people in the door. And then when they get there, the culture is not set up for them to succeed. I think there's a lot of responsibility actually has to lie on the executives and the people managers. So we started actually focusing a lot on what I call modern manager skills. What does it take to be a truly successful manager in today's society when you are working with dynamic workforces? Where I've seen so much gap is in managers, being able to understand that we're not just workers inside companies. And I think this applies to all people, not just underrepresented people, but just being able to have curiosity and empathy around what are all the different identities that we are bringing into the workplace, and knowing that knowing that those identities actually have an impact on the way that we experience the workplace. I think that is a fundamental thing that I think a lot of people don't understand, that, now we're all in the workplace, all of our experiences are the same. which is not accurate, right? The Kapor Center, based in Oakland, released a report that studied why women and people of color are exiting the tech industry. They found that the number one reason why people leave tech is due to their sense of unfairness. And some of the stats are truly alarming, where up to 48% and 47% of Black women and Latinas have experienced daily microaggressions, something around being mistaken at their own tech companies as being custodial staff.
That's happened to me here at Berkeley.
It happens across all industries, right? So those types of daily microaggressions, even though they might seem subtle, small, and just, something that people didn't intend to harm people with, have an impact on whether people feel like they belong in a workplace. Also, in terms of responsibilities of managers who hold organizational power to advance certain people to the next level of leadership, because what we're also seeing as trends is there's a lot of people of color in the junior level staffing positions, and not a lot of people represented at the leadership or board level. And when we see how people move through the organization, we see that there's much higher level of scrutiny on Black employees, much higher level of scrutiny on underrepresented people, and that's leading them to get unfair scores when it comes time to do performance reviews and management. So there's a lot of really subtle hidden biases that I think don't often get called out, that end up having a massive impact in creating this disparity across power levels inside the organization and whose voices are heard, and how people are feeling like they belong in a certain workplace versus not. And I think there's a series of things that we can play around with, but I think everybody's trying to figure out, at the root of it, can we actually all agree that based on who we are and how we show up in the workplace, that our experiences differ, and therefore we need to be very conscious about the way that we are managing people, the way we are structuring processes and policies so that it benefits everyone, not just the default group of people who've been benefiting.
So having a Taco Tuesday is not enough. Do either of you want to share some of the practices that you've implemented to create an inclusive environment? I know in particular the fairness thing reminds me of your transparency around salaries and promotions.
I can share a few strategies that we use, and I think, like Michelle said, there's so much here that I'll just scratch the surface. But one thing we do, well, I guess one question I have for all of you is, how many of you have ever had, when you've left a company, an exit interview? Have you gone through that process? Yeah. Oh. So the first time we had someone leave, which we were really fortunate, just 5 years after the company founding, someone left and we were doing an exit interview, and I was like, this is weird. This person, like, we were asking this person what they would have, we could have changed for them as they were heading out the door. And so one thing we started doing after that is what we call stay interviews. So this idea of every 6 months, our HR person will meet with everyone in the company and ask the exit interview questions, or they're adapted over time. And so we've been doing this since 2015 to thematically collect feedback. It's anonymous. The HR person brings the themes to leadership. And it's incredibly powerful as a way to build a more inclusive environment for folks, because then we're getting sort of the real feedback. And we're probably not getting all of it. I recognize that it's really challenging for folks to share what's really on their mind, but it's an opportunity. And we constantly think about how we can create more of those opportunities through other anonymous surveys, and then the surveys also collect demographic information so we can understand, are certain groups significantly less engaged than others, and what can we do to address that. But I think the one tactical stay interview piece is one that I've, after I've talking to other companies, they've adopted and have seen gains as well, because it's this notion of you collect real feedback from your employees while they're there, and they're sharing how they're feeling, the interactions they've had with other people, how they're feeling about their manager, in a way that typically they don't have an avenue to share. No one wants to go to HR to complain about their manager, but if their HR is there asking them these questions, they're more likely to share that. And it's much better than when they're heading out the door, which, at that point, it's great feedback, but you've lost that person. So tactically, that's one thing we've done. And then, Alita, I'll touch on the salary transparency, since you mentioned it. Before even, I think, my personal D&I journey, the sense of fairness sort of exists in all the work I do at Magoosh, and so I felt that sort of negotiating on salary was just an odd thing personally. It didn't really make sense to me that someone might get paid more for doing the same role at the same level than someone else, and so we had a sort of no negotiation policy on salary. What we realized over time is that you need a much more robust framework. So what we've done, borrowing from a number of other companies, is we collect industry salary data, we create roles and have levels for each of those roles with associated salaries. So an employee, they're an entry-level marketer, a level 1 marketer, they know what their salary is and they know what a level 2, 3, 4, 5 marketer makes. They can see the entire track. And then their manager has honest conversations with them every quarter about how they're progressing towards that next level. And then each of those sort of salary steps are calibrated with a group of leadership, so that we're trying to be, it's not just at the manager's discretion, but there's a level of fairness that we're trying to implement so that others can sort of talk about how their teams are comparing. And then HR tries to flag people who might potentially who should have been brought up, who haven't been brought up, by looking at the data, looking at who hasn't been brought up over what period of time and are there any trends there. And so we've built out this framework, and now when we post all of our job descriptions, we share the salary range, because why not? Now folks know that when they're applying, this is the range, and usually it's not a range, it's like level, there's 3 possible levels depending on your experience, so it's just one salary, another salary, a third salary. And we apply that to equity compensation as well. So everything is sort of formula-based, and it keeps leveling up for everyone at the same sort of scale and process.
So if you just sat in on Juliana's class, all of that negotiation stuff won't work out.
Yeah. The nice thing is that I'm sure we lose candidates, but we let them know from the beginning. From when they apply, we say we don't negotiate on salary, this is the range. And so, it actually helps us, we've seen, attract folks from certain demographics, because they sort of realize that there's a rationale for why we do that. Yeah. And then it might detract others, and that's okay. We're okay losing those folks.
Yeah. I sat in on Juliana's class, and one of the things that she mentioned was about 25% of the population never negotiates. And so I imagine for some folks, it's really comforting to come in and just know they're getting a fair deal, that everybody else is making the same amount, and they don't have to try to figure out. And as a woman of color, I'll say, like, there's always this kind of little nagging thought of, like, is this because I'm a woman of color? Or, like, if I was a guy, would I think, would I approach the situation differently, or would I be treated differently? And so it kind of takes all of that mental energy out of the equation and allows you to just be your full self in a, like, feeling valued for what the skills that you bring are. So
that's the hope.
Yeah.
Well, there's also data now that shows that before people were saying women are not negotiating, so women need to negotiate more. But now the data is showing that actually women have been negotiating, and women of color are also negotiating, but there's negative repercussions attached to negotiating for a certain demographic group. Yeah. So I think that's a great policy. And talking about negative repercussions, I think a lot of times leaders ask me, why aren't these people sharing with me honest feedback around, I love that there's a mechanism through which you're actually gathering feedback. And I think the level of organizational psychological safety felt by different marginalized groups of people also will dictate how accurate of data and honest information you're going to be getting from people. Because there's a lot of fear around negative repercussions that people, through lived experiences, have learned to negotiate within themselves before bringing it up to the surface. So I think that's always, when it comes to gathering feedback, data, even if it's anonymized, even for anonymous inclusion surveys, I've heard from employees like, I'm not sharing this data, honestly, because I don't know how they're going to be tracking me, my IP. There's lots of layers when it comes to, I think, gathering truly honest data. So I think always, being able to listen to the most underrepresented, marginalized groups in the workplace will be a good start, and building that trust and psychological safety where people can truly be honest about their experiences.
And I think beyond the psychological safety, it's do you have a track record of doing something about that data, right? Yep. We just had our climate survey across UC Berkeley, and I had been relying, they do it every 5 years across the UC system. I've been relying on the data from the last from 5 years ago to demonstrate, like, here's the experience our students are having in the classroom, or here's, what our faculty, who's exiting and what are those looking like, and very similar patterns happen in academia. So I personally think that data is really valuable and allows us to inform our programming, but if for those last 4 years before I got here, nobody was doing anything with that data, right, it might have created a little bit of like, why bother, and lower response rate. And I think there's another aspect, I raised my hand when you mentioned the being confused for a custodian, but I have those daily microaggressions that sometimes it doesn't even occur to me to bring up to anybody because it's like just part of my life at this point. But I can imagine that there might be a point where if there were a lot of hard things that that I might just walk away without having told anybody because there were so many other things that were challenging, right? I fortunately feel really supported and valued and enjoy my job here and feel like I'm making an impact, so it's meaningful. So it allows me to tolerate those, these other things that might happen around campus. But all of these, it gets complicated, and I can imagine that for folks who are trying to figure out what can I do differently in the workplace to create an inclusive environment to attract and retain, a diverse workforce, but also try to consider what might be those needs. How do we create psychological safety? I don't know if any of you want to speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so I think just in hearing some of the points that have been brought up, I think it's interesting to think about inclusivity, right? And realizing that it does cut both ways in terms of underrepresented and also overrepresented, majority demographics. And I think that's one of the things that we had to deal with at West Point. And I remember it was 2016, and the Charlottesville riots had just taken place, and there was this huge discussion across the military and Department of Defense as to what we should do with Confederate monuments, right? And do they have a place as a historical kind of relic, or should they be removed? And I think one of the most important things that leaders, because everyone in this room is a leader within your respective organizations, I think one of the most important things that we as leaders are really accountable to do is just to be able to feel the pulse of your organization and really think about the impacts that your statements or your policies are going to have on the entirety of your culture. So one of the things that we did was we created a space, right, for students really on both sides of the discussion to have an open dialogue about the issue, right? And I know while it would be very easy to say, hey, at least in my opinion, be gone with all the Confederate monuments, let's tear them all down. And but that's not always the right answer, right? Because there is a
It might be better.
Yeah, in this case it might be.
But I understand.
Yeah. But to your point, there are people who, based on their beliefs that they came into the program with, based on their family history, based on, and I think while you may arrive to a different solution, at least giving those individuals the space to feel like their voice is heard, to feel like their voice is appreciated. That's kind of been the balance for us. Is I think it's easy to kind of skew in one direction, and you may have a silent majority out there that feels a way about something that never gets vocalized, and then you've got these silos, right? And one of the biggest challenges that we've tried to overcome is breaking down these silos. So maybe we do have an uncomfortable conversation, but at least now we're building a culture that is inclusive of all our various viewpoints.
Yeah.
I
I
have so many
appreciate
feelings.
that. Sorry.
Sorry
to use humor on that. And I appreciate because you are in a setting and a situation where you have to be mindful and not completely alienate a segment of the population, and that maybe it means just engaging in conversation, and maybe you come to the same conclusion through engaging in conversation. Maybe there's some other, this is where those negotiation skills might come into play, right? Maybe the names change, but the monuments stay, or the monuments go, but the names stay. There might be some other things that get funded or additional monuments that get set up, or additional naming, right? Like you never know, but if you don't engage you just basically end up separating out. But
And I did have one caveat to that too, and I think it's important to set a baseline of expectation when you go into these conversations too. I think before any of these dialogues take place, it's important to reinforce your cultural norms and values, right?
Yeah.
Cultures of respect and dignity and empathy and understanding. While you can vary in opinions, still ensuring that, hey, as an organization, we value the dignity and respect of others, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can still have those challenging conversations while reinforcing some of those norms that you want to enforce in your culture.
And therefore creating that safety.
That's right. Yeah,
right?
that's right.
That on both sides, folks know you will hold that standard and ultimately hold the space and make
That's
sure
right.
that they're also being represented and heard.
Yeah.
Michelle, did you want to respond? I don't know if you want to respond offline or thoughts.
I think I appreciate, and I also appreciate your context, where you are.
Yeah.
And I think there's also very much similarities in tech and corporate space.
Yeah.
Where there is these silos and also a lot of unspoken tension among people and employees who hold varying degrees of opinions or beliefs. I think what I've also seen lacking is just the fundamental education around why these things are bad, like why Confederate statues are bad, and just being able to say that and go into the historical information around well, this is why people hate it, and therefore we can make a decision around do we agree with the values and symbolism of the statue. Similarly, in tech or corporate setting, there's a lot of conversations happening, now resurfacing with a couple years ago Google manifesto. I don't know if y'all are familiar, but this software engineer wrote a manifesto about how diversity programs are discriminatory against white men. And these employee resource groups, affinity groups that have been created to provide a safe space for people to gather and build community and organize are now seen as reverse discriminating against the majority. And I think all of these things, in isolation and vacuum, sure, their logic makes sense. But what they're not understanding is that this is not existing in a vacuum. There's historical context, there's institutional context attached to why these programs are necessary. Yeah. And I think because of that context and education missing, people are mad on both sides. So how do we actually close that gap through dialogue, through education, actually explaining the impact and the implications of these programs or the statues, what have you? I think that is at the core of what I'm seeing as the biggest vacuum right now, because people on all sides are just angry because they feel they're not being heard and their values are being taken away. When I think if we go back to the core value, hey, as a company, we value fairness. We value dignity. What does that look like from all parties? And let's make sure that the context is not lost in what we're working with in terms of the institutional and societal history. So I think that's why all of these things are really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say not just historical context, but current climate.
Absolutely.
Externally, like political climate in our country.
Totally.
Whether or not folks were born and raised here, or whether they came here as international students or immigrated here. The reality is that we continue to have pretty highly visible, I'll say, attacks, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from bombings to an increase in hate crimes, and certainly there's a lot of visibility around things that have been happening for decades, but how women have been treated in the workplace, right? And so that folks are going into workspaces carrying that awareness, and certainly, as somebody who works in a school space, I have to be thinking about the literal physical safety of our students, and at the very least their emotional capacity to come in and learn when they're walking in from that context, from that external context of what's happening in our country or globally, and that they're hearing about in the news, and then having to walk into a space. And I see you nodding. Does that come up, or how do you address those kinds of things when there are these, I guess I think that's the value of having affinity groups internally that could provide some of that safety or education, or just like knowing you have somebody to go to, that you're not alone in that experience, that somebody else can kind of see you and know what you might be going through similarly, that you can just, even if it's just like a nod in agreement or elbow, you know, like, you know, going to the bathroom to cry if you need to or whatever it might be. But yeah, I think about the importance of psychological safety in a company at a time where folks are coming in a little bit more aroused than maybe they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. I don't know if that's fair to say, but
I absolutely think that's the current context and climate. And I actually wrote a blog about this, so check it out. It's called Managing Teams in Times of Political Trauma. And I think what managers and CEOs and leaders are starting to learn is that the workplace and the political realm and the personal realm, they all blend. It's no longer check your politics at the door, because politics are impacting people inside the workplaces. So, you know, PwC president and CEO released a statement about Charlottesville. You know, more and more CEOs are starting to address these political and you know, cultural
taking a stance,
events and taking a stance, because it's starting to, you know, it's no longer these, you know, clear silos that we're operating within. You know, when it comes to immigration issues, it impacts our workforce. So I think more and more leaders are starting to build up that muscle and courage to be able to address certain issues, and for certain ones being more compelled to actually say what is wrong and what is right.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, aside from politics, it's more of a values and morality issue for a lot of CEOs who are taking a stance, which I really appreciate. And even if you don't want to get into the political conversations, I think there's ways in which that you can create space for people to actually voice if they are being impacted by certain things. Saying some things like, hey, this past weekend, what happened in Charlottesville really impacted me. I just want y'all to know that, you know, that's on my mind. If anyone needs to talk about something, let me know, right? I'm just going to create space for you to be able to come to me. You know, do you need an extra support this week? How can we reshift priorities so that you can really focus on what needs to get done, but also have some space to be able to, you know, sit with all the complexities of what is happening that may be impacting you or people you love in your community. So I think there are subtle things that you can do to just acknowledge and create space for it, rather than, you know, we're not asking people to organize a protest or rally outside the workplace, but that, you know, clearly acknowledging that these things impact how people show up in the workplace and be able to focus on the work at hand.
Right,
Yeah.
and in the classroom also.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the things that that Berkeley's known for is our defining leadership principles. And in the last admission survey for our full-time students, that was the primary reason people chose to come here. And one of the things that I've heard in general about the millennial generation is that they want to work for somebody that stands for something, right? Like that if they find or perceive the company that they're working for is not being aligned with their values, they're willing to walk away. And you mentioned, Bvander, that you know, folks give you feedback about the blogs that they're seeing, you know, that you're writing in terms of making your work visible. And I imagine on some level it's that alignment around fairness, right? Even if the salary might not be exactly what they thought, you know, but if they think about incrementally that there's a little bit more assuredness that they're gonna get those increases at the same rate as other people, they end up kind of winning out. But wondering how you think about like values. I know this wasn't on the questions at the time.
It's great.
Like how as a company or corporation you convey those values, or how you work with your staff to continue to kind of perpetuate, like this is what we stand for, even if it's not taking a political stance, but around the, you know, kind of the fairness, and obviously your product has that mission as well.
Yeah, I didn't really talk about sort of the mission component of our product, but a lot of the reason we got into this space of test prep is sort of recognizing that those who had more means historically received more access. They could afford sort of more expensive classes, more expensive tutors, and then continued to sort of perpetuate this gap that existed. And what we were hoping to do with Magoosh is to really help close that gap and provide lower cost and free offerings, and like looking to partner with nonprofits for free offerings, or figuring out a way to offer free materials that would still help folks prepare. And so that's sort of a core that brings everyone to our company together, is this notion of we want to help close this gap. But beyond that, very sort of early on in our company, we sort of aligned on some core values, and they've evolved over time. But we do actually have a set of core values. And you know, I talk about fairness as something being really important to me, but it's not, fairness is not one of our values. We have a number of overlaps with the defining principles of Haas, which is interesting. So one of our values is all of them are structured inequalities, where one thing is better than something else, where that other thing is also potentially good at some other company. So it's not just good is better than bad. So one is I mentioned done is greater than perfect, and this idea of we want people to feel comfortable taking risks and moving faster and not trying to perfect something, because we also care about speed of work. Another one is wow is greater than profit. And so that sort of lets folks know that in any situation, when you're dealing with a customer, when you're dealing with a colleague, if you choose the wow option, so you do a refund outside of our typical policy, or an employee had a weird experience in our HR team, like where there's some compliance issue and they can't get some funds of some health program that were owed to them, or our HR team will say, well, we'll just pay you that, whatever it is, that aligns with our values, and they know they're empowered to make those decisions, and that we're all sort of held accountable to them. And so more than just defining these 10 values, which I've written about in another blog post and that we sort of talk about, we sort of try to incorporate them in our daily conversation. So one is communication is greater than efficiency, and we'll talk about how when people come out of a meeting and they write up a summary and they'll say like in the spirit of communication with a capital C, and so everyone knows like we're talking about that value. Or people will share something and they'll say, you know, this is on its way to done with a capital D, and so that gets reinforced through all that communication. And then we do these monthly meetings across the company, where then we do shout outs, and we do shout outs across the company where people shout out folks for these values. So they just continue to get reinforced in a way that's, you know, greater than any one individual. And for me, it's been great because it's a way for people to share feedback to me as the CEO, saying they didn't feel like something I did was in line with one of the values, which is, you know, in which cases they're often correct, and then I can sort of think about, okay, what did I do? How would I change that? But without those sort of shared values, it's much harder. It's already incredibly hard to share upward feedback, and without that, I think it gets even harder. And so for us, we found that those values help us sort of align as a company, but then also help folks who then read about them and see sort of the pieces around them decide to come into Magoosh. And when we hire outside of the competency components that we think about, we also think about alignment, or how people will challenge our values in a really positive way, or push on some values where we don't feel like we're represented well within the company. And so we then think about sort of our hiring process with respect to those. And, you know, we don't like, there's this notion of like hiring for culture fit, or would you want to like grab a beer with someone, which rather than that, for us, it's more, how well do we feel like this person aligns with our set of values? We have a rubric for that. We calibrate on that. We look at how our high performers in the company are sort of doing against that rubric, so we can consistently like validate it and make sure that if we need to tweak our questions for the interview process, we do that. And there's a lot sort of under the hood, but the same way we sort of push on the competency assessments that I talked about, we do the same thing with culture interviews, which is a lot deeper than just would I want to hang out with this person. But it's something that I guess, I haven't talked much about it, but it's like another thing I care deeply about.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to give our audience the opportunity to ask our panelists any questions that might have come up for you as you've been listening to them, or our conversation, or anything that you'd like to know more about in terms of particular challenges or things that have come up as you try to implement some additional diversity, equity, inclusion lens. Well, I'll ask them a question while you formulate what you'd like to ask. And I'll ask folks to line up at the mic. This is being recorded. That way we can get the voice on the recording. But as we have folks line up, I'm wondering if you could speak to, you know, we've talked a lot about leaderships, like your leadership roles, but also that how important it is for this to come from the top up. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what like one kind of thing that somebody who doesn't have a lot of power can do within their company or organization to start to create some change or to implement. Wow, we got a good
Yeah.
lineup. So if one of you wants to respond to that.
So I think, Michelle, you brought up a great point. I think people often underestimate the impact of small actions, right? And I think something as simple as, hey, I saw this is going on in the news today, and just want to let you know I'm here if you want to talk about it, and leaving it at that. Because I think sometimes it's easy to think, man, we gotta roll out this huge initiative, we gotta get all this funding. But I think if you can reinforce some of those cultural values of empathy, of selflessness, going beyond yourself, I think these are all things that any person in an organization can do, and it doesn't take very long to do. And I think the bottom line for us as leaders and managers is, you always want your coworkers to be able to bring their full selves into the office, right? And as you think about, productivity and being able to work towards, galvanize a team towards a goal, I think whenever you have someone who feels that they can't bring their full selves into the office, or they're dealing with a challenge, whether it's related to diversity or not related to diversity, I think just creating that space to say, hey, I understand we have stuff we need to take care of, but I'm here for you. Right. If you need anything, I can take that time, right. I can pause and create that space. I think more than anything else, that has been extremely effective in my organization. I've seen it have great impact.
Yeah, in terms of building that sense of connection, right? We never know what might be impacting.
Yeah.
So like I might be aware of certain kinds of news, but it might even be that, somebody's parent is struggling with cancer, or that your child didn't want to get in the car that morning and you're like frazzled from battling that whole thing, right?
Well, what's funny is
just having an opening there to connect.
So I started doing this when I was in school, but I always asked twice, right? I said, how are you doing? And of course, the first time you ask me how you're doing, oh yeah, I'm doing fine. Yeah, like no, really, like how are you doing? Like, you're good? Okay, and if the answer is okay, then that's fine. But sometimes if you just pause to even ask that second time, no, really, like, is everything okay? You might find out about, a loss in the family or something that's really bothering somebody. So I think, not just, doing it at face value, but genuinely, wanting to connect on that level goes a long way. Yeah.
So my question's actually for you,
for me.
Given your role at Haas. Not that I've got questions for you too, but I'm going to let the other folks ask some questions. I was a 99, and I remember when I was here, we were maybe a third women. That might be on the high side. But I'm curious what Haas has done over the past few years to both increase gender diversity and racial and other forms of diversity at the school.
Thank you for your question. I think the credit really goes to our students. So a few years back, we had a group of students in the full-time program and started the Gender Equity Initiative. And what they took on for themselves, and they did some, kind of took their MBA skills and and did some research, did some interviews, and essentially the effort that they started was to make phone calls to admitted students and encourage them to come to Haas and share what their experiences were as women. They also, have created tip sheets for our faculty members around what is that classroom experience like for women. Our evening weekend program then modeled what was happening in the full-time program, and they don't have like a formal, so the Gender Equity Initiative technically is a 1-credit independent study class. In the evening weekend program, the numbers are actually even lower, and so they just kind of taken it on themselves to do the same thing, and at times even calling women, kind of the week of the deadline who haven't submitted their application, where there's clearly some missing materials, just to call and encourage them and see, like, is there anything we can do? How do we support you? So as students, they have a lot more wiggle room than an admissions officer might, or than a staff and faculty member, specifically because the California law doesn't allow us to do anything different in the admissions process for women or underrepresented minorities. So our students have really taken up that initiative. In terms of underrepresented minorities, we have the Race Inclusion Initiative, and so both of the initiatives have a pillar that looks at careers, what are those outcomes, what are those salaries, offers, are there any differences, they give feedback around what that process feels like. There's the academics pillar that looks at what is the content in the curriculum and who are the guest speakers and who are the GSIs. So they're really looking at the student experience from that lens, and then there's an admissions pillar for both of them. And our admissions pillar in the Race Inclusion Initiative this last year had a lot of suggestions that we implemented into our admissions process across all 3 of our MBA programs. So we added a question on socioeconomic status, so from family of origin, if you were first generation in your family to go to college, if you had some family circumstances, like if you were raised by in foster care or by extended family, if you had responsibility for other family members, et cetera. And so that socioeconomic status question was optional, but it was rolled out across all 3 of our programs. It's not obviously a perfect proxy for race, but we do think that that's, as a public institution, that it's important to try to start extending some of those opportunities and looking at what are those circumstances and how might that have impacted somebody's trajectory, and the opportunity to see those accomplishments under a different light, right? Somebody might have the same exact career, position, et cetera, but you realize, like, wow, they overcame all these things, and maybe they had to make a different decision of their undergrad to attend so that they could, might not have gone away to an Ivy League and might have gone to Cal State, for example, or something like that because of family circumstances. So those are some of the things that we implemented this year. We also added so in the interview process for admissions, we added a question about contributions to diversity. So elevating that as one of the factors that was considered. So not race, not gender, but what have you been doing in your workspace or in your service to demonstrate that this is something that you care about, that you're going to continue to carry on here when you're a student here. So again, that got implemented across our programs. And I put together a rubric for how that would be scored. And then we also, I'm blanking on one more thing. Well, we increased our scholarship offers for those students who came in through the consortium, which is kind of our catchment for contributions to diversity. So students who are interested in increasing diversity in the workplace apply through the consortium. So again, it's not specific to race or gender, but if that's your passion and your mission, you have to have demonstrated efforts. So this year we were able to increase our scholarships in the full-time program and in the evening weekend program, not to the same level, but that allowed us to, once they got admitted, allowed us to actually get them to commit to Haas. So we had a pretty big increase this year. So thank you for the question.
You've all mentioned how important it is for the leaders in organizations to be fully bought in and behind DEI initiatives. But Michelle, you said something interesting, I thought, which is that leaders also have to go through sort of a personal self-examination and go through a process on an individual level. And I'm wondering if you could speak about what that process might involve in your consulting. Do you work with individual leaders, and especially the ones who aren't the ones who brought you in, maybe, aren't totally sold on the importance of it, and what that would involve?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a very common struggle inside companies. And so I think when I am invited to go to a company to provide workshops, or our team provides programming, we actually, at the front end, we pick organizations that are actually already somewhat committed to the mission of increasing diversity and equity and inclusion. And that's because I've done all spectrum of workshops with different types of audiences. The workshops that we provide really isn't as effective when we do it in front of a group of people who are kind of like sitting like this and like, why am I here, right? And I think there's a special different types of work that need to be done in order to convince people of the business case for diversity and inclusion, or perhaps the social impact of that, or because philosophically, I don't believe that we do this work purely for profitability reasons. Because the question that I asked then to leaders who are, demanding business cases, so if there was no business case, would you be totally cool with having just white men at your company? So I think the business case falls apart pretty quickly when we start to think about, the longevity of that argument. And I think having said that, when the vast majority of companies that we work with, there are maybe some members of the C-suite who are bought in, and some members of the C-suite who are not, or maybe one or two members who are more aware of these issues than others. I think leveraging them as sponsors of the initiative and having them be the sort of the gateway into whispering into the other executives' ears that this is important has helped a lot, because I think, especially if people are still on their journey of being more conscious, I think the messengers, unfortunately, also plays a role in how people hear the messages. And I also would, recommend other CEOs who've been exemplary in advancing some of these initiatives as role models that folks can check out. Especially, because I think, fortunately, there's definitely some business cases to be made around, organizations that are harnessing the power of diversity and inclusion thriving compared to, ones that are being in the news for all the wrong reasons. So sometimes I'm hearing arguments also, when motivating and inspiring people to do this is not working, there's also plenty of case studies that will instill fear into those executives' eyes around, all the stuff that is happening in tech particularly, and also the corporate space. So I've used all tactics, and I think, partnering with folks in the organization who might have that respect from the leaders that you're trying to convince, I think, to me, has been the fastest shortcut to getting into their sponsorship realm.
I want to acknowledge that we're at time, but we have about half an hour before the next session. So we're going to continue to take questions, but if you need to step out, I want to give permission to those folks who might have other obligations. But we want to continue the conversation. So with the permission of the panelists, we'll hear the rest of the questions.
Hi, Adrienne Hogue, BS 86, MBA 94. So just a quick, more of a comment than a question. Having been in business for 30 plus years and seeing a lot of continued talk about trying to make workspaces more diverse, it's getting a little annoying. And so wanting to know if anyone has any thoughts about sort of really doing, how do you shake up this process that we keep going through where there's always a lot of talk or something happens in the news, and wanting to hire more African Americans, for example, or more women in business school or something of that nature. And one of the things that came to mind, so more of a comment than anything else, is maybe doing some sort of immersion where you're, getting companies to send people from their organizations into maybe predominantly African American companies or something, because I find that I now work for a nonprofit after 30 years in the corporate space, and I work for an organization that works with formerly incarcerated folks. And I can tell you, I didn't even like to watch prison movies, let alone think that I was going to work with folks who were formerly incarcerated. And now that I'm working with this group, and my mind is totally like, what was I afraid of, or what was I thinking, or what were my preconceptions about this group of people? And maybe there needs to be something that really shakes up people. If I had not gone to work in that space, I would not know how great these folks are to work with, or how like-minded they are, or how they have kids like I have a kid, and all of those same things. And so just throwing it out there that you guys are young leaders in this space to start thinking about doing something that's very radical and very different, because we keep seeming to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So
I don't know if you're aware, but we at UC Berkeley have an undergrad program that is for formerly incarcerated. I shouldn't say undergrad program. In the undergrad admissions, there is a pipeline for formerly incarcerated adults.
And
so,
I think that's a great thing. A lot of smart people out there who made mistakes when they were young, but have a lot to contribute. And I think if we could, again, do something different that get people sort of to Michelle's point of getting people to get below the surface of these conversations, but part of that is breaking bread and sitting down and working with people and seeing that they're just like we are.
Yes.
And I think that will go a long way. And congratulations to Magoosh to doing this anonymity and finding out that people really do deserve a chance and are as smart as other folks.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that certainly the bias literature shows that when you tokenize, you have contact with just one example of somebody, then in your mind, all you do is like, oh, well, but you're an exception. You're different, right? But when you have deeper relationships and more of them, then all you start to see is that common ground. We have the same kind of humor, or I have a child, or whatever it might be that you connect with that goes beyond all the identities, right? So balancing the importance of acknowledging and recognizing that we all have different lived experiences and how we move through the world, and how do you make space for that, with also realizing that, in any normal curve, the bulk of it, right? So like the bulk of our human experience is gonna overlap.
Mm-hmm. Hi, my name is Dan Ng, MBA 94. So I have a good experience in general, but when I unpack it, it gets to be a question of how do we continue that good experience more generally. So I work at Kaiser Permanente, which is historically really does a great job of representing diverse people from the CEO on down. We can do better in the technology and IT areas, but in general, we have a really diverse workspace. And I have had an employee who was an immigrant, and so his wife was in a different part of the country, because sometimes when you're an immigrant, this is the things you do, and they were the only people from their family in the United States. So they didn't have a support network, and she was pregnant with a high-risk pregnancy. So I really went through a lot of extra effort to make that work for him, getting him to work remotely and then take a personal leave. And then eventually it wasn't sustainable, so actually referred him, and he got hired by a different Kaiser region, where he lived. So it all worked out great, and as a result, he's probably going to be with the company for 10, 20, 30 years, and it's a really good result. The thing is, at any point as a manager, I could have just said, it's really too much, let's just part ways, it's not working out for us. But I'm an immigrant, my parents were immigrants, and I know that when they came to this country, they were the first people from their family to come here. And if it weren't for people that kind of did the same thing for them, they wouldn't have been able to make that work. And the thing is, so that's all positive, but this really comes down to the fact that as a manager, I am still following all the policies of the company, but I have huge discretion to try to make things work or not work.
Right.
Now, if I was a different person, a different company, I could use that discretion to perpetuate an old boys network, right? I mean, we play golf together, let me make things work out for you. In this case, it's a good result, but how do you, so in my company, the culture is one of diversity and inclusion. So in a sense, it all fits together. But again, where's managers ultimately are the people that have the discretion to make things work, on a day-to-day level. So how do we, extend that, you know what I mean? So it's hard to think about that.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think we're getting a little bit at allyship too, which was going to be our closing question anyway. So I'm wondering if you can speak to when you've been able to show up for a community or a particular group that you don't identify with, but that you were trying to figure out how do we kind of go beyond ourselves, right? But also beyond our own historical knowledge of, like, it sounds like you were informed very much from your personal experience that you can empathize. So how do you stretch, given your work? Are there times that you have kind of stood up as an ally? I'll start with Kenny.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that example, first and foremost. I think, especially in the military, there are definitely two schools of thought in terms of managerial styles. And from my own experience, I remember when I was in company command, so I was in charge of about 115 soldiers. My leadership style was very much different than some of my peers, and it was very much to the style that you just mentioned, where you try to work with individuals on a case-by-case basis to meet them where they're at, to set them up for success. And I had a leader tell me that I was out there giving foot rubs and, the kinder, gentler army. And, but when you looked at the performance of my unit in comparison to other units, we were leaps and bounds ahead of our peers because of the culture and the climate that we had created. And I think as managers, especially as senior managers, it's important to reinforce that behavior is a good thing, right? And hopefully your mentee, goes on to some of his coworkers and shares the story that he had, because what I can tell you is that those always end up being the best employees, right? And I'm sure you saw it with the young man that you helped out, is even just going a little bit extra to help alleviate a pain point for a soldier or for an employee. Man, the level of motivation that I saw in my own soldiers was amazing. And then in my current position, I think one of the things that's most interesting in terms of allies is, I think a lot of times when you think specifically about recruiting African Americans or recruiting women, you kind of put yourself in the box of, well, I need African Americans to go recruit African Americans, or I need women to go recruit women, right? And some of the most impactful people that I've had work with my team have been white males. And I think what's interesting about that is, for me as an African American male to go into a high school and say, hey, I believe in you, I think you have exactly what it takes to come to West Point, it's gonna mean one thing, right? But to hear someone who doesn't look like you, who doesn't sound like you, who doesn't come from where you come from, say that exact same thing, the impact of that can be very valuable and very, very meaningful too. So I think that was the last thing that I kind of wanted to say, is just realizing that your voice as someone who is outside of the group is tremendously powerful and impactful. I'll never forget being in class here, as a matter of fact, and we were having the discussion about affirmative action, right? And I was the only African American in the class at the time, and there's always this pressure for people are waiting for you to. So, can you tell me what you think about the topic? And I remember I had a classmate who was a white male who shared his view before I did, and said, hey, these are kind of my beliefs. This is why I think this is important. This is why I think, and it just freed up the space, and it took the burden off my shoulders. Be like, okay, I don't have to be the one to communicate this point, right? So, as we're thinking about our own organizations, I think the importance of being an ally to a group that doesn't look like you, that doesn't represent what you represent, is so impactful. And I think the feedback that you'll receive from your coworkers. I mean, I've had people open up to me, when in talking about women's issues, and I'm like, oh man, thank you so much for sharing your opinion on this. I wasn't going to mention it, but once you mentioned it, it gave me the space to open up that dialogue. So I think that's just one thing to put in our respective toolkits is, your voice is impactful for your own group, but it can be exponentially impactful for folks that don't look and come from backgrounds like yours.
And I'll share personally, I don't think I would be here if it wasn't for being mentored by Black male faculty as an undergrad and as a grad student, and Chicano faculty that were male also, that was all about feminist, girl power, but having, just my undergrad professor freshman year right off the bat got me started on the research path, told me exactly what I needed to do to get my PhD, and he was the only person of color in our whole university, and he spotted me. And to me, that allyship and coalition was so meaningful that, to me, it's a practice I continue to do today, is also just kind of figuring out where I could step up for others. Mm-hmm. I know we're out of time. I want to give each of you the opportunity to say one thing. A lot of times folks come into these conversations or this work with the feeling of trepidation or anxiety or stress of I don't know, DEI. How do you take care of yourselves? How do you recharge and keep it going? Can you share one thing that you do for self-care that we can model and offer for others?
Therapy. I think everybody deserves therapy, and finding a good therapist is life-changing. I think there's still so much stigma around mental health issues, and I am super proud to be going to therapy.
I was hoping one of you would say therapy.
So I think for me, it's actually humility. And I think when you first get into this space, you feel like you're the person that's going to tip the scale, and you're going to come in, and you're going to have all the solutions. And if you just pour your heart into everything, everything's going to be better, right? Yeah. And realizing that, change is incremental.
Absolutely.
So it's important to create boundaries for yourself and realize that the world's going to keep spinning if you unplug, and everything is okay. And I think for me, just being able to take that step back and say, hey, after I leave, there's going to be another person that's going to come up and try to pick up the reins where I left off, and that's okay, right? And just taking the time to reconnect with family and spend quality time to re-energize. And remember, the whole point of what you're doing in the first place has been very helpful for me. So,
Thank you.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, mine's somewhat similar in that sort of this notion of taking a break, and I say this with a sense of privilege of, I recognize that in some scenarios people can't take a break from this work because it just is all around them, but a mental break. So for me, that's whether it's spending time with family or one of the things I do on the side is I used to play Ultimate Frisbee competitively, and now I coach. And it's just a way for me to spend my time doing something completely different. And I'm still thinking about, I coach of mixed gender teams. I'm still thinking about the dynamic there, but it's separate from sort of the work. But it gives me just an opportunity to be fully immersed into something else. And recognizing that, like, if you're constantly just thinking about all of the challenges, and you're just going to wear yourself out and then can't sort of continue for the long term. And so for me, it's just knowing that coming back to it again and recharging in some way, but also recognizing that, to your point about allyship, and this is a second note, so I'm stealing a little bit more time.
No worries.
I was talking to a friend who's a really close friend in a Haas MBA, who's a co-founder of another company. He's a white male. His other co-founder's white male, and sort of sharing with him this realization as he's observed things within his organization that he's asking, like, which battles should he fight with his co-founder around issues around diversity and inclusion. And I told him, look, you're in a place where you have the luxury and the privilege of choosing. And some people don't have that. And so, if you truly want to be an ally with your position of power in the organization and your position of privilege as a white male, think of a lens where you don't have the option, and so you fight every battle because you don't have a choice. And it was sort of, for him, that it resonated of this, he can choose, and that choice is a privilege. And so I think that's something that I'm starting to understand, being a person of color, but also of sort of an association that's not typically underrepresented, and then being a male and a hetero male at that, I carry a lot of privilege, and so recognizing I can hide from conversation, and so pushing myself to say, oh, that's not a luxury that everyone has.
Thank you for acknowledging that, and for each of you for sharing your well-being practices. I'll say for me, it's music, dancing, going to concerts. Like, I think of it as a spiritual experience and recharge. But I want to thank each of you for spending some time. Oh,
sorry. I just want to say one thing, which is that I think today we talked about a lot of different identities, and we also didn't talk about a lot of identities.
Absolutely.
So I just want to, just make sure that we're never forgetting those communities that we're not, who's not in the room, who's not represented here. I think, we talked a lot about women's issues. Let's just also always be mindful that gender is not just a binary, trans, non-conforming people. The issues are so urgent. People are dying. So I just want to make sure that we leave the room not forgetting about who was not represented here, and I feel very much responsible for making sure that there's space for that.
Thank you. Yeah, trans women of color have the highest homicide rate.
That's right.
So thank you, each of you, for making the time, taking time with me.
Thank you.